St. Patrick's Cathedral, June 8, 1968. Andy Williams stood before 2,300 mourners and millions watching on television. He was about to sing at his friend Robert F. Kennedy's funeral, a task almost too painful to bear. The organ began its introduction to Ave Maria. Andy opened his mouth to sing, but his voice cracked. The note wouldn't come. For 5 seconds that felt like eternity, there was only silence. Then Ethel Kennedy stood up from the front pew, walked toward him, and Andy leaned down. What he whispered to her next made even the priests turn away to hide their tears. Kennedy wasn't just a politician to Andy Williams. He was a friend. They'd met in the early 1960s when Bobby was serving as Attorney General under his brother President John F. Kennedy. Andy had performed at Kennedy family events, and over time, a genuine friendship developed between the smooth-voiced entertainer and the passionate political crusader. They were an unlikely pair. Andy was the embodiment of wholesome American entertainment. His variety show was a staple in living rooms across the country, his voice synonymous with comfort and elegance. Bobby Kennedy was intense, driven, sometimes abrasive in his pursuit of justice. But they shared something deeper, a belief in using their platforms to make the world better. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, Andy watched his friend Bobby transform from a political operative into something more profound, a champion for the forgotten, the poor, the oppressed. By 1968, Bobby Kennedy was running for president. The country was being torn apart by the Vietnam War and racial tensions. Bobby's campaign was electric. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered because Bobby spoke about pain and hope in ways that resonated with people who felt abandoned. Andy quietly supported Bobby's campaign as a friend who believed in what he was trying to do. Then came June 5, 1968. Bobby Kennedy had just won the California Democratic primary. As he left the stage at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles through the kitchen pantry, a man named Sirhan fired a .22 caliber revolver at close range. Bobby was struck 3 times. Andy Williams was in New York when he heard the news. Like millions of Americans, he watched in disbelief as reports came in. Bobby had been rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital. His condition was critical. For 26 hours, the nation held its breath. At 1:44 a.m. on June 6, Robert F. Kennedy died. He was 42 years old. He left behind his wife Ethel, who was pregnant with their 11th child, and 10 other children. America exploded in grief and rage. This was the second Kennedy assassination in less than 5 years. Martin Luther King Jr. had been murdered just 2 months earlier. Andy Williams sat in his apartment and wept. The next day, Ethel Kennedy's office called with a request. Would Andy be willing to sing Ave Maria at Bobby's funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral? Andy's immediate reaction was to say no. Not because he didn't want to honor his friend, but because he didn't know if he could physically do it. But then he thought about Ethel, about those 11 children, about Bobby who'd never backed down from a difficult task. I'll do it, Andy said. For Bobby, for Ethel, for those children. What he didn't say was that he had no idea how he was actually going to accomplish it. June 8, 1968 dawned gray and heavy over New York City. St. Patrick's Cathedral was filled beyond capacity. 2,300 people sat in the pews, senators, congressmen, celebrities, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens. Outside, another 100,000 people lined Fifth Avenue in silence. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was suffocating with grief. This wasn't just sadness. It was despair, anger, a sense that something fundamental about America had broken. Andy arrived 2 hours early. He needed time to prepare, to practice, to somehow find the strength to do what he'd promised. But when he stood in the empty cathedral and tried to sing Ave Maria, his voice failed him completely. The notes wouldn't come. His throat constricted. Tears filled his eyes. I can't do this, he told the music director. I'm going to fail up there. The music director, an elderly priest, put his hand on Andy's shoulder. Mr. Williams, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. But Andy knew that millions would be watching on television, that this moment would be recorded in history. He tried again. His voice cracked on the first phrase. What if I can't get through it? He asked. Then you can't get through it, the priest replied. and that will be honest. And honesty is all we have left. The funeral mass began at 10 a.m. President Lyndon Johnson was there. Jacqueline Kennedy was there with her children. Senators, Supreme Court justices, all of America's power and conscience had gathered. But everyone's eyes kept returning to the front pew, where Ethel Kennedy sat surrounded by her children. Kathleen, 16, Joe, 15, Robert Jr., David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Max, down to baby Douglas, just 6 months old. Ethel's face was pale but composed. She'd barely slept since Bobby was shot. But anyone who looked closely could see that Ethel Kennedy was operating on pure willpower, and that willpower was running out. The mass proceeded with formal solemnity. Senator Ted Kennedy gave a eulogy that left the entire cathedral in tears. Then came the moment for Andy Williams to sing. The organ began the introduction to Ave Maria, those haunting, ascending notes that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. Andy walked to the microphone at the altar. He looked out at the sea of devastated faces, at the coffin draped in an American flag, and he looked down at Ethel Kennedy in the front pew. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Andy saw something that broke him. Ethel wasn't just grieving. She was terrified. Terrified of raising 11 children alone. Terrified of facing life without the man she loved. The organ finished its introduction. The cathedral went silent. Andy opened his mouth, and nothing came out. His voice, that instrument that had carried him through thousands of performances, simply failed. He tried again. A sound emerged, but it was cracked, broken. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence became unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably. The organist looked confused. Andy stood frozen, his worst fear realized. He was failing, in front of the nation, at the moment when his friend and that grieving family needed him most. Then something unexpected happened. Ethel Kennedy stood up from the front pew. Every eye in the cathedral turned to watch as Ethel Kennedy, dressed in black, moved out of her pew and walked toward the altar where Andy stood. She wasn't rushing. She was simply walking toward someone who was in pain, the same way thousands of people had walked toward her in the past 3 days. When she reached Andy, she didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside him. Andy looked down at her. This woman who'd just lost her husband, who was pregnant, who had 10 other children depending on her, and she had left her pew to comfort him. "I'm so sorry," Andy whispered. I can't do this for you." Ethel reached up and gently took his hand. Her eyes looked into his with understanding. And then Ethel Kennedy whispered 3 words that no one else could hear. "Yes, you can." Not "it's okay." Not "don't worry." But a simple statement of belief. Yes, you can. She squeezed his hand once, smiled at him, and walked back to her pew. Andy Williams stood at that microphone, watching this woman who'd just given him strength when she had none left to give. And something shifted inside him. He nodded to the organist. The introduction began again. And this time, when Andy opened his mouth, his voice emerged. It wasn't perfect. It was raw, emotional, breaking in places. But it was real, and it was beautiful in its brokenness. Ave Maria, Grazia Plena. As Andy sang, something happened in that cathedral. The grief that had been choking everyone began to transform into something else. Not hope exactly, it was too soon for hope, but acceptance. The understanding that life continues even in the darkest moments. Andy's voice grew stronger as he sang, gaining confidence from Ethel's simple act of faith. The Latin words filled the cathedral, rising up to the vaulted ceiling and beyond. People began to cry openly, not just from sadness, but from the beauty of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a polished performance. This was one broken human being singing for another. When Andy reached the final phrases, "Ora pro nobis peccatoribus," "Pray for us sinners," his voice cracked again. But this time it didn't stop him. He sang through the break, through the tears, through everything. The final note hung in the air, a single pure tone that seemed to contain all the sorrow and beauty of that impossible moment. Then silence again. But this time it was different. Sacred silence, the kind that follows something profoundly meaningful. Andy walked down from the altar, but instead of returning to his seat, he stopped at Ethel's pew and knelt beside her. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me up there." Ethel shook her head slightly. No, you saved yourself. You just needed someone to believe you could. Then she added something that would stay with Andy forever. That's what Bobby would have done. He always believed people could do more than they thought they could. The footage of Andy Williams's performance at Robert F. Kennedy's funeral became one of the most replayed moments in television history. But what people remembered wasn't the singing itself, it was the humanity of it. The moment when Ethel Kennedy walked to comfort the man who was there to comfort her. Andy received thousands of letters from people who'd watched on television. They weren't praising his vocal performance. They were letters from people struggling with their own grief who'd seen Andy's struggle and Ethel's response and found something that helped them. I watched you almost fail and then succeed anyway, one letter read. And it made me realize that maybe I can get through my own impossible day. Andy never spoke publicly about what happened at that microphone. When asked, he would simply say, "It was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done, and I couldn't have done it without Ethel Kennedy's strength." But privately, Andy talked about how that moment changed him. "I learned that strength isn't about being perfect," he told friends. "Strength is about showing up when it's hard, trying even when you might fail, and accepting help when you need it." Ethel rarely spoke about it either. But in a 1993 interview, she said, "People think I was being strong for Andy, but really I was being selfish. I needed him to sing. I needed to hear Ave Maria for Bobby. We needed each other." The moment at St. Patrick's Cathedral became a reference point for understanding authentic emotion in public performance. It challenged the idea that performers must always be polished and in control. The three words Ethel whispered, "Yes, you can," became a mantra for people facing seemingly impossible tasks. But more than the words, what resonated was the image of two people holding each other up in the darkest moment. Ethel, who had every right to collapse in her own grief, instead giving strength to someone else. Andy, who thought he was there to serve, instead receiving grace. When Andy Williams died in 2012 at age 84, almost every obituary mentioned June 8, 1968, and what happened in St. Patrick's Cathedral. At Andy's funeral, one of Ethel Kennedy's children stood up to speak. "Andy Williams gave our family many gifts over the years," they said. "But the greatest gift was showing us that it's okay to struggle, that asking for help isn't weakness, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't do something alone." The story asks us to reconsider what we think strength looks like. We live in a culture that prizes competence and control. We admire people who never seem to break, who handle pressure with grace. But Andy Williams's moment reminds us that real strength often looks different. Real strength is showing up even when you're not sure you can succeed. Real strength is accepting help when you need it. Real strength is being honest about your limitations while still trying to exceed them. And perhaps most importantly, real strength is recognizing when someone else needs help, even when you yourself are drowning. Ethel Kennedy, in the depths of her own grief, had enough awareness to help someone else. That wasn't weakness. That was transcendent strength. When we watch the footage of that moment, grainy black and white images of a man struggling to sing and a woman walking forward to help him, we're watching something that transcends entertainment or politics or even death itself. We're watching two human beings refusing to let each other fail. We're watching grief transform into grace. We're watching the best of what humans can be for each other in the worst of times. Andy Williams sang Ave Maria at Robert F. Kennedy's funeral. But the real song that day wasn't the Latin prayer. It was the unspoken melody of compassion that Ethel Kennedy offered when she whispered, "Yes, you can." And in doing so, they both showed America something it desperately needed to see, that we are stronger together than alone, that helping each other through impossible moments is what makes us human, and that sometimes the greatest performances aren't the perfect ones. They're the ones where we show up, broken but willing, and let others help us become more than we thought we could be. If this incredible story of strength, vulnerability, and human connection moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to struggle and that asking for help is a sign of courage, not weakness. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you didn't believe in yourself? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that reveal the best of humanity.